Welcome to Happy Planet, where we speak with entrepreneurs, investors, and thought leaders driving the impact economy. I am your host, Abigail Carroll. Just a quick reminder before we get going today, if you like what we're doing, please do share your thoughts by leaving a rating or review wherever you listen. And if you have suggestions or ideas for me, please do not hesitate to reach out through our website, happyplanetpodcast.com. We've spoken to a lot of entrepreneurs from around the world in the past few months, and there is one thing they all have in common: a corporation. The precise structures of corporations will vary from company to company and country to country, but a relatively new corporate certification is helping us better understand which companies are truly impact-oriented. To better understand this phenomenon, we're speaking today with Ben Anderson, who until very recently was the CEO of B Lab, the organization responsible for the B Corp Certification. Ben offered us the opportunity for a deep dive into the world of benefit corporations. This can help entrepreneurs, investors, and consumers learn why they should care about companies that are getting a B. Welcome to the podcast, Ben.
Great to be here.
I'm really excited to hear more about your work with B Corp today. You were the CEO of B Labs in the United States and Canada, and you oversaw some 2,000 B Corps in that region. I would love to know more about the history of how you got involved.
Great. Well, I used to be the chief operating officer of a company called Preserve, which makes consumer products using closed-loop systems. So company's best known for turning yogurt cups into toothbrushes and other stylish home products like food storage containers and tableware. So if you've shopped in a Trader Joe's or a Whole Foods or any of your local co-ops, you've seen the bright colored Preserve products there. And so Preserve certified in 2011, and that's something that I was a catalyst for. There were fewer than 500 B Corps then, and we decided to certify the company.
Right. So you decided to jump ship at one point and actually join the B Corp movement.
Yeah, so after about 9 years at Preserve, started to look about how I could have broader systemic impact. And in a conversation with one of the founders, Jay Cohen Gilbert, B Lab founders, he recruited me, encouraged me to come to B Lab where I could have impact across thousands of companies. And so it was a natural segue into that work. And the three founders were looking to kind of bring in other leadership at that stage of the organization. And so there were a couple of us that had been working in B Corps that were pulled into leadership roles.
Yeah. So how does B Corp work? We see these logos on shop windows and, on websites. What does it mean to be a B Corp?
Yeah, so people will recognize the B with a circle around it and then a line underneath it. And I'm sure that most of your listeners can go into their pantry and find some tea or granola or something else that has a B. So you just need to look for it. And so B stands for benefit or public benefit. So B Corps all have a public benefit and they meet the highest global performance standard. And so B Lab has an assessment that goes across 5 stakeholder categories: governance, workers, community, environment, and customers. And so a company would go through about 100 questions that B Lab would then verify the performance of. And so if people meet this threshold, in our case, an 80 points in the system, and they make a distinct governance change to shift from a shareholder-driven model to a stakeholder-driven model, and then they can certify as a B Corp.
So can you give me some examples of, some of these criteria, like the community or workers?
Yeah, let's start with worker. The subcategories within that would be things like financial security, health and wellness, career development, and engagement and satisfaction. So within that, and one of the most highly weighted ones is living wage. So most people know minimum wage, and that is often set at the state level.
Not the same thing.
But a living wage is something that's substantially different, which is you are earning the income that allows you to meet your full needs. And so there's different living wages if you're single or if you have a family. And so within the point system that B Lab allocates, a living wage is highly weighted.
Really interesting. So, what about the environment? What are some of the standards there?
Yeah, so there we would look at things like air and climate, water, land use, impact on life, and then also just like your operational efficiency as it relates to if you're in a manufacturing environment, are you kind of recycling the waste in that system? But we'll also look at things like carbon emissions. And one of the things that B Corp community has done is galvanize the entire community and others through its leadership to be net zero by 2030.
Yeah.
B Corps are very strong on the environment, and so you're going to see exemplars across the board in this category.
Right. I think too, you'd mentioned to me before that you're not just responsible for yourselves. The verification doesn't just happen on your company, it goes all the way down your value chain. So you can't have a B Corp status if the people that you interface with or that you're buying products with don't. Is that correct?
I would say it like this is we have a positive point system. And so you can get credit across all the positive things that you're doing in your company and your immediate operations, or if there are things that are happening in your supply chain. So you get awarded points for where you're performing. You have to meet this high bar. So you have to be doing something across all of our
Yeah.
categories. And so depending on the type of business, if you're in a manufacturing business, the impacts within your supply chain are going to be incredibly important. So we lean on lots of other standards as part of what we do. So we will award points for certified organic or fair trade.
Yeah.
And so we will use lots of others that are going much deeper into the supply chain. And then we look across. And in some cases, we have to do our own verification in categories. Like in the living wage example, we would look through payrolls and understand, is this company paying living wage? If there was another certifier that did that, we might rely on that certifier to do that.
It's really interesting. Like these big companies are opening their books to this third party verification that seems pretty exceptional, right? Isn't that a real cultural shift?
It is. And in addition, we require transparency as part of this. And so you can go on to the directory and of the 6,000 B Corps globally, you can see how they're performing at a high level across these categories. And you could even compare. And if you are a public company or subsidiary of a public company, you're required to disclose your full assessment. And so we require additional transparency for those companies. So you can go in and you'll see on our website, how is this company doing?
So, I'm a corporation. I want to come in and be certified. You do a certification process. How long does that take?
The complexity definitely increases the larger the company. So if you're a 5-person marketing firm and the impacts that you have are like pretty contained, it could be a fairly quick process for you internally. So that could take you a month. As you start to get into a bigger company, maybe as 100 employees, you would form a team, you have 3 or 4 people, and you need somebody in HR, somebody in finance, somebody in operations, be able to answer these about 100 questions. If you're a large company, in the extreme example, let's take Danone, the French dairy company. We know Danone yogurt, and they own lots of other brands that people would know, like Horizon Milk. They have approached this on a subsidiary basis. So they certified the North American Danone, about $5+ billion company. And that might take a year to do. And then the entire company is in the process of certifying the $30 billion company. And that's about a 4 or 5 year journey to certify. So it's quite a range depending on the scale and complexity.
And do you get any benefit for being in the process? Is there a, B Corp pending logo that you can put up if you're in the middle of this?
It's a good question. We do have a pending B Corp logo for companies that are startups and who don't have a year of performance, but are going to meet our governance requirement and take a pro forma BIA. So we do have something like that. I think what you're referring to what might fit there is we have a program called Movement Builders. We want to have a relationship with multinationals. We need the scale of multinationals in order to accomplish the systems change that we seek. But we recognize, like in the case of Danone or others, they're going to take a very long time to get there. And so we have created a way for them to align with our movement, not be able to use the B Corp logo, but affiliate with the community.
Yeah.
And the requirement there is that they take action on things like advancing stakeholder governance because they're often in the public markets, and that's a place where there's still pioneering work to do.
Right. It just seems like a completely different challenge trying to certify a Dannon and trying to certify a young startup. What are the
Absolutely.
costs associated with this?
Yeah, it's a scaled pricing based on your size. So if you're 100 million or above, it's going to be $25,000 in that tier and sort of tiered by revenue. Or if you're a small company, it's going to be a couple $1,000s. And we do have an equity pricing as we seek to create a more diverse and inclusive community. If you identify as BIPOC owned or women owned business, there's discounts that we have.
Is that an annual thing? Because you do have work ongoing, right? You don't just show up, get verification, and then go back to your old ways. You have a new bar that you have to maintain.
Companies pay an annual fee to remain a certified B Corp, and then we recertify the companies every 3 years. And so this is a chance for us to see like how you have grown. And because this is a management system, and what a lot of CEOs think of this as the guardrails for running a good business, when you naturally, if you certify at 82 points, you say, oh, there's all these other aspirations we have around the business. So let's set in place this measurement system around carbon emissions, for instance.
Yeah.
And then a couple of years later, you'll be able to say, hey, this is where we were. This is how we reduced our carbon emissions. We see companies naturally improving performance as they go through the system, and they also like to check in. It is also important because often these are growth-oriented companies, and there are actually like 100 assessments behind the front door. So if you're a 1 to 10 worker company, and then you shift into the next category up, there will be different expectations for you around the things that you offer to your workers, for instance, health and benefits. And this is also, we need to take into account different geographies. In some places where health benefits are just like required by the country, we need to look at that differently. So there's quite a bit of different complexity and context that we need to account for around the world.
With all the criticism right now on the ESG standards and how there's a lot of greenwashing, it seems to me that we need more standards like this to actually just enable companies to be able to have a truly verified marker for them to make these ESG claims that they're all sort of seeking to make right now. Are you finding a lot of growth in response to the pushback about this ESG greenwashing stuff?
Yeah, so I'll give some context. During COVID, like everybody, we were concerned like where's the world going to go and what's going to be the impact. What we actually saw was significantly accelerated demand for companies wanting to certify. So that's the kind of moment we're in, is incredible accelerating demand for B Corp. And this is the way the world is going. Certainly the headlines catch a lot of attention around sort of this anti-woke, anti-ESG thing. But just stepping back as a business owner, understanding your business and having a management system for measuring the performance of it is good for business. It's good business to evaluate your company across all of your stakeholders. And many companies naturally do look at their stakeholders, but if you don't have a formalized system around it, you will not understand kind of the impact and also be able to set goals. And so what we've seen, and I know we'll have amazing data when we just get a little bit further away from this COVID period, is B Corps have been incredibly resilient. We've had the highest retention in our community during this period, and we've seen companies be sort of incredibly financially resilient. And the reason is, one, they know their businesses really well, and two, they were already doing things like paying a living wage, offering health benefits, all of the things that much larger companies started to get attention for, saying, we're going to implement this flex policy so that people can go to the doctor. That's things that B Corps do naturally, and that just leads to a much more resilient business and leads to long-term performance. So if you're very short-term focused, that's what you're going to do. But if you're going to take a much longer perspective, you're going to do better over the long term.
It seems like this is really reflecting a sort of more fundamental shift in just even capitalism and how we see the role of business. You mentioned that you have to change your governance, bylaws or something like that to turn the focus away from a pure shareholder value to the stakeholder value idea. And that's a fundamental shift.
Yeah, let's push into that because it's really distinctive and differentiated the way we approach this. So, in the course of creating the certification, the founders recognized through their own experience of exiting and selling a business that they wanted ways to ensure that all of the positive things stayed long term. And so, due to Milton Friedman and others, there's kind of been this shift to a shareholder driven model. But if you look at the history of the company and the creation of that corporate form, it was often for public goods like railroads and roads.
Interesting.
And so we've gotten a bit away from that. And there is also legal sort of backing that companies use. And so what B Lab did was create a new corporate form called the Benefit Corp. And so what this did was legally allow companies to shift from a shareholder driven model to a stakeholder driven model. So among the stakeholders is still shareholders, and they are a primary stakeholder, of course, in a company.
Of course.
But it's formalizing and allowing a board to elect expanded fiduciary duty. And this is good for the company and it's good for the long term, but it's distinctly different. And so a company, if you're a C Corp, you would need to elect Benefit Corp. If you happen to be, for instance, an LLC, you can incorporate that stakeholder view right into the operating agreement. So how you accomplish this stakeholder view is different based on the corporate form that you start with, but it is common to all B Corps that they have the stakeholder view. And what we've seen, we've passed legislation in 40 states to create the Benefit Corp, and now there's dozens of other countries that are adopting this. So it's propagating around the world right now, and this is where the world is going.
Well, I think it's really interesting also because if you're doing business internationally, you have all these different sort of corporate indicators, different ways different countries organize their companies. And this actually gives sort of it's almost a homogenizing of a standard. There's a certain core shared principles that are signified by this B Corp status.
So this is definitely a global movement. There are about 6,000 companies globally in 87 countries. And you're right, this does create a sort of a common language and a common standard. So you can know a company in Europe, it's a consumer product versus company in the US, and have a way of comparing them. This is also probably a good point to note that there are over 200,000 companies globally that have used the standards. So they haven't necessarily certified, but they're using that guardrails for running a good business. And this is how you take a small community of companies and leverage their leadership for global impact. And so the rate at which companies are just logging in, looking at the assessment, thinking about how they can improve performance, they don't necessarily need to have the aspirations to be a B Corp, but if they want to be like a B Corp, that's how we're going to drive systems change. So we're all sort of on the same page. And now the sort of where this is going is that companies are taking collective action on different things. The B Corp movement has moved towards this net zero by 2030. And so that's like a global collective action that we've taken on.
And in line with a lot of the UN goals, right?
Absolutely. And we mapped our standards to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as did additional standards work around the SDGs. So there is actually a product that we've created that you can find on bcorporation.net, and you can measure your impacts and use those standards across the SDGs.
Interesting. After a short break, we'll continue our conversation and talk about the future of benefit corporations. A big thanks to the Maine Technology Institute, MTI, investing in innovation for a prosperous Maine. MTI is Maine's unique public-private partnership whose core mission is to diversify and grow Maine's economy by accelerating innovation in the state's targeted technology sectors. MTI offers grants, loans, equity investments, and services to support Maine entrepreneurs and organizations as they transform their innovative ideas into new products, services, and companies, leading to the creation of quality jobs for Maine people. For more information about MTI and its programs, please visit mainetechnology.org. For a blue economy to thrive, people need to use more sustainable products. But which products? And will consumers actually adopt them? Innovators like you are hustling to figure this out. Spark number 9 can tell you if there's demand for your product. Spark markets your product before it's built using online advertising so you launch smarter. Have a big idea? Vet it with Spark before you build. Visit Spark online at www.sparkno9.com or find them on LinkedIn. Welcome back to Happy Planet. So just getting back to these 200,000 users who are working to meet these standards, but they haven't applied, what do you think is keeping them from taking that next step?
I don't think it's necessarily a bad sign that they're not all certified. Our aspiration isn't that every company would certify, and it may not make sense for every company, or companies may be, strong in one area and they're using it to work on their environmental side of their business.
Yeah.
But the natural thing is once you start measuring things and you see other categories, we see companies sort of naturally making improvement across the entire kind of spectrum of where people are at a starting point. But in logging in to this free tool, the B Impact Assessment, you're kind of taking a step to look at the purpose of your company and measure impacts and hopefully improve your company for a public benefit.
If I'm a new company today, I'm a startup, right? Let's say I'm a startup and I am doing climate work. Why should I go through this now as opposed to waiting, a year or two or until after I'm funded? Or, what's the benefit of a startup that really doesn't have a lot of employees? Secondly to that, can a startup get accreditation if it's not paying its employees salaries, but it's just paying them in equity for the short startup period?
Great question. And so I think it is a great choice for certain startups, but not for all startups. So if this is a situation where you're just still figuring out what you're doing with the business model, and there's things that you need your whole attention to, I would encourage companies to figure that out. However, it doesn't hurt you to open up the B Impact Assessment and understand the direction that you want to set for your company, because there's things that you can put into practice without trying to certify. There are other startups that may be venture backed or have certain type of investment where they know they're going to grow. And the benefit of certifying earlier in a high growth situation is you don't sort of grow in the wrong direction. And the second thing is that you get to affiliate with a community of leaders. So there's some ability to say, hey, I'm part of this community. I'm the Patagonia of organic farming in Maine or something like that. And so you can kind of credential yourselves with the broader community, and that will help prospectively with your marketing and storytelling.
That's really nice. You can up your social impact by creating alliances with other big brands. Do you find companies are sometimes overestimating their own organizational strengths and how well they're organized according to your standards?
Yes. In almost all cases, a company will come in, and the typical example is that they feel really good. They submit, they have a score of 95. And when we go through and really look at things and press in, they'll get sort of a knockback to say 75. And then there'll be clear lanes for them to say, oh, this is what I need to do. I actually need to document this as a practice, but it's not necessarily a policy, or this is something that we do, but I haven't measured it, so I can't take credit. So it's not that they're trying to take points in a deceitful way. It's just learning how to use and apply the standards. And so it's very natural for companies to do that. It's also very natural for companies to kind of get the credit for what they're already doing and then saying, hey, we're better than this. And we actually want to do these other things as we certify. And so we do actually see a lot of formalizing things that happens on the way in. And this was my experience at Preserve. We had a belief around community service and giving employees the opportunity to volunteer on company time. We didn't have it as like a formalized policy, and we weren't tracking it. And so by doing that, people then used it, did it more. And so there's a really good positive social impact that comes out of this process.
Right. So the process really is, the first step is a self-evaluation. And then you see, okay, I'm a 95 in my own opinion. And then when you apply, there's a verification that's a pretty deep dive. Is there ever a scenario where a company just goes to you without doing the sort of self-analysis and says, I need some coaching? Is that a service you all give?
We haven't in the US because of our sort of proximity to the global standards body, which is also based in the US. So we have not done consulting, and it's not generally not good practice for the verifier to do that.
Right.
With some of the global partners, there's more independence. However, there is a whole array of consultants that are ready, willing, and able to help companies. And I believe some of those are listed on the website, or B Lab can help make the connection. But it's also like an easy Google search. You'll turn up several dozen of them. So there's a whole industry around helping companies, because sometimes it's an expertise issue and sometimes it's a bandwidth issue, or there's other things that are going on. It's helpful to have a helping hand who's been through it a number of times.
Yeah, I can see that. So what's next for B Corp? Like, where's this all going?
So I'd answer that on sort of in two different ways. One, in the US-Canada context, which was the global partner that I ran. There's a new strategy, which is to scale transformational business practices and policies along the pillars of racial equity, climate justice, and stakeholder governance. So we've talked a bit about stakeholder governance, where B Lab is most expert in the world, and we do a lot of work there and are doing policy work there. On climate justice, we have lots of leaders on climate within the B Corp community. And so integrating justice into that work is a growth and stretch area. And then on the racial equity front, racial equity has been in the standards from the beginning. And we have always framed our work as working on an inclusive economy where there's shared and durable prosperity for all people. And so what we've found is we really needed to center racial equity in the strategy to ensure, for instance, that our community was accessible and relevant to traditionally marginalized entrepreneurs, and create systems and approaches that make this a place that is relevant and they want to be, so that we as a community can be sort of fully diverse and representative of the U.S. community. And so B Corps are now increasingly taking action. And so an example of something that the B Corp community has done is to not try to necessarily be the leader, but join with other leaders. And so B Lab is part of the Corporate Racial Equity Alliance. And so PolicyLink, for instance, is a strong partner, and the CREA has created this thing called the CEO Blueprint for Racial Equity. So B Lab brings standards experience and also a community of companies that could apply the CEO Blueprint. And so that's what we would bring to the table. So that's how I would answer kind of the first piece, which is the US-Canadian context.
It gives me a lot of optimism. I also feel like, we're looking back a lot right now. And it seems like a lot of what was old is new again. You mentioned that corporations really had a public benefit role, 100 years ago or more. And somehow we got off track. And it sounds like people like B Corp and others are really trying to get us back on track with a more sustainable approach to capitalism.
Yeah. And so we are trying to use the system to change the system. I agree. It's sort of getting back to basics. And a lot of this is just common sense. If you run a business that's good for your workers, they're going to stay long term, they're going to grow, they're going to help your business. And so, of course, there's certain industries, particularly where there's kind of this like race to the bottom in terms of like wages and competitiveness to try to offer a cheaper and cheaper product. But kind of over the long term, that's generally not the approach. And so, yes, it's getting back to kind of basics. And every company, I believe, starts with actually a purpose to do something good in the world. But over time, you make decisions that dilute that purpose. You get off course, and some of that can be for market reasons, and some of that often is because of the investment that you bring in that kind of warps the direction of your company. And so by aligning your business as a benefit corp and taking the stakeholder approach, it gives you more flexibility, and the board in its fiduciary duty is allowed to kind of balance different interests of the company. And so, yes, this is increasingly, I think, where companies are going and affiliating, whether it's with B Corp or kind of other aligned movements around the world.
So, the public companies that are B Corps, is there any data on how they're actually performing or not performing on the stock market compared to their competitors who are not B Corps?
I would say it's still pretty early days. And so when I came into B Lab 8 years ago, we were still proving out and getting private investors comfortable with the certification as well as this governance approach. And so the evolution there was just first like getting private investors to like neutral. They're not against it, maybe they're not for it. But then what we've seen is hundreds and hundreds of VCs, private equity companies investing in B Corps. And they do incredibly well. And it's more recently that we've been able to kind of crack into the public markets. Because again, it was like a different thing for a benefit corp, the legal structure that certifies a B Corp to then do an IPO. And so we now have about 30 companies around the world, many that are kind of smaller, but we've had some more flashy IPOs like the company Allbirds, which has this sustainable shoe company, or Lemonade, which is an innovative insurance company. You may know Coursera as an education-focused company. So we'll see, but it's early days, but generally those companies are doing very well.
There certainly seems to be no lack of interest in mission-based businesses right now in the private investment arena. I'm seeing a lot in the VC world. So let's hope that this really takes root and continues this journey.
And one thing I just wanted to get to the second piece in terms of like where things are going with the B Corp community. On the global front, we are underway with an update and expansion of the standards as it applies to the businesses. And so, as I mentioned previously, there's over 100 different things that you might be getting points awarded for across the 5 kind of major categories of the assessment. And so you can get up the mountain to 80 to certify a lot of different ways. And what we've tried to take stock in over the last 2 or 3 years is there a minimum performance requirement in certain categories that just, if you're going to be a B Corp, like you have to do this certain thing. And so, for example, since we've talked about living wage and fair wages earlier, one of the proposed things is that workers can afford a decent standard of living for themselves and their families, and there's a wage equality among the workforce. And so there's 10 things that B Lab has determined are most integral and is seeking and engaging the community around this actively right now. So we've just closed this comment period around this. But if I were to say, where's the world going? B Corps will, in addition to being holistically high performing, will also be known to pay fair wage, to be in net zero by 2030, and sort of other things that are just the part of the fabric of being a certified B Corp.
So you end up also in a virtuous cycle, because if someone looks at a B Corp and knows that they're going to get a fair wage, they're going to want to apply there, and you're going to get a lot of employee retention. And, that's going to bring benefits to the company. And it just seems like it's a very positive cycle.
Yeah, there is a whole array of benefits to certifying, many that are internal facing, like locking in mission, but recruiting and retaining talent is the top thing that CEOs state. Like, why are we certifying? People who want to work here are asking if we're certified. And then I've heard on the other side, like when we've certified, they're getting the best talent because this is where the next workforce wants to work.
Wow. So you're no longer the CEO, but you are still proselytizing for B Corp and you're involved with B Corp. What else is in store for Ben?
I'm a B Corp alum and actually just came back from the annual Champions Retreat where we build community. And so I'm still actively engaged with B Lab on the racial equity front. And so part of a racial equity group called White Men for Racial Justice that's trying to engage white men in racial equity work as well as I'm doing some
Love it.
strategy consulting for a racial equity organization. And actually, we're going to work to kind of bring this broad-based racial equity training to the whole B Corp community, and also engaging sort of white men leaders in the work too. So still a strong racial equity interest, and it's something that's very important to me. And it's nice I'm sort of bringing multiple parts of my life together. And then the second thing I'm doing as we move back from New York to Massachusetts, where I grew up, is looking more at economic systems change on a regional basis. So I'm in the south coast of Massachusetts and have a real passion for this community. And so I've just been getting proximate to members of the community and understanding what's going on and how might I bring my impact background to this kind of region, which includes Fall River and New Bedford.
Very interesting. What is the personal interest in racial justice? I mean, I understand the intellectual and the emotional and the societal interest, but it sounds like this is an issue that's quite personal to you.
Yeah, well, earlier in my career, I spent a decade in education working in Boston with after-school programs and a charter school to bring about equity in the educational system using a racial lens. So that was like a core part of my work. And so that's been a sort of, through B Lab, a way to get back to this work and centering it in the strategy. It is, in my belief, in the US context, the only way we're going to drive to an inclusive economy is if we bring about racial equity. And so as you go about your learning journey, and everybody should be getting on this journey to kind of learn the history, because we learn history in one way, but there's lots of versions of history from different points of view that we need to learn about. As I've gone on that journey and also done my personal work, I increasingly am impassioned about trying to use the power and influence that I have to ensure that all people have a similar footing and start on the same level.
That's beautiful. Well, thank you for all that you're doing. I think it's a really important direction for us to be going in. And if we're not inclusive, we're not going to solve the big problems that are ahead of us with, climate and inclusion, and even politically. I think having a more inclusive economy is going to solve a lot of world geopolitical issues as well.
Agree. And I think the message I would have is everybody can work in an impact-oriented business, and it shouldn't be an exclusive thing. And so, yes, the B Corp community is a group of leaders who've met this high performance bar, but every company can be taking steps to drive impact in their business, and encourage people to use the free tool, the B Impact Assessment that B Lab offers.
What a delight to have Ben on the show today to help us better understand the ins and outs of the B Corp Certification program. I've seen that logo in windows of companies in various countries, but now I really understand what it all means. I think what I find so interesting in this, and it relates to the interviews we've had so far, is the willingness of companies to pursue this certification on their own. Corporations seem to be trending away from Milton Friedman's cold pursuit of shareholder value towards a more Keynesian ideal of social equity. But in this case, it's not the government levying taxes and oversight. It's a private corporation that is offering the certification, and it's being adopted willfully by corporations. And in the end, it looks like when stakeholder values are met, shareholder value often follows. That's a win-win for our mission-driven entrepreneurs and investors. Thank you for listening. Please follow Happy Planet wherever you listen and leave us a rating and review. It really helps new listeners discover the show. Happy Planet was reported and hosted by me. I'm also the executive producer. The talented Dylan Hoyer is our producer and editor. Composer George Brandel-Egloff created the theme music. Learn more about my work and get in touch by visiting happyplanetpodcast.com.